know that there will be a post survey coming after, post feedback survey coming after our webinar today. So we would greatly appreciate it if y'all could make sure to fill that out. And without further ado, and with a great amount of gratitude, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. McQuillin. It's all you, Sam.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm seeing some familiar names in the chat thing. So I'm going to jump into this because I want my full hour. I give permission to cut me off when it's time to go. But the title for today's talk is Youth Mentoring and Antidote to Social Isolation. Let me see if I can go forward. Also, we just started our lab's Instagram account for the University of South Carolina's Youth Empowerment Schools and Systems Research Lab with like co-direct with Mariah Kornblue. And I also have my Twitter up there. So welcome. I'm going to show some great pictures of the beautiful University of South Carolina, which I'm very proud that I actually took. So I own the rights to these, so I can share them as much as I want. But wanted to give a little background for what this talk is about, what this webinar is about. I always tell my students to come up with a thesis for their papers, what the paper's about, and this is my attempt to make that thesis. So the point of this webinar, or the thesis of this webinar, is that the current generation of young people are experiencing a pandemic of social isolation and loneliness. And this pandemic is ravaging their mental health and their well-being. And it's unparalleled in modern history. And most important, we adults have a role to play in the cure or the antidote for this pandemic. So in this presentation, I hope to highlight how serious the impact of school closures have been for young people, especially those from under-resourced or minoritized populations, and especially those who suffer from mental health problems. I hope to specifically highlight the promise of youth mentoring as a strategy to both reduce the psychological harm caused by social isolation, but also as a tool to strengthen and expand child services for young people. So with that being said, we will jump right in, and hopefully I can accomplish those things. So the agenda for today is I'd like to first go over two natural experiments that we've seen over the past decade. And I call this the phone and the virus, and I'm referring to the use of smartphones by our current Gen Z and the generation that came up. So for many of us, these were devices that were either late into our adolescence or early into our adulthood we were exposed to, but for this generation, they largely grew up with them. Also wanted to speak briefly about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and especially school closures on the social isolation it's caused young people. I'd then like to jump into the science of youth mentoring and why I believe that mentoring is a potentially tremendously useful tool in navigating the social isolation. And in this work, I want to present a new framework that my colleagues, Dr. Tim Cavell, who's at the University of Arkansas, and Renee Spencer, who's at Boston University, have created to describe how we see the future of mentoring research and practice playing out across the country. It's our hope for how it will look. And I also want to provide some practical examples of model programs that are reaching the function of this framework that I provide. All right. First part, we're going to go over the phone and the virus. So one of the facts that we actually learned prior to COVID-19, so this is from 2018, is that Gen Z is the loneliest generation in recorded history since we've been recording loneliness or tracking loneliness. And this became a concern well before COVID-19. It was largely the focus of research and development efforts by insurance companies like this one, which is CIGNA. Companies like these, especially now, are incentivized to have healthy people paying them for insurance. So they typically invest research and development dollars to understand potential health threats and so on. One of the features of this research work is the health consequences, both physical and mental health, of loneliness. And what we've seen is this tidal wave of loneliness among Gen Z. One of the major features of this research and what researchers find, as well as these insurance companies, And also our common sense would tell us this too, is that loneliness is toxic. In fact, the recent meta-analytic research that I'm showing right here indicates that loneliness is a stronger risk factor for a range of health related costs than things like smoking or obesity. This is true in young people as well as people who are aging. So this is not to say too, so one of the threats to this research that maybe a savvy research method student would say is that, well, this might just be that all young people are lonely, and perhaps this is an indicator that just young people feel more lonely than others. But actually, uh, there's a longitudinal research or cross-sectional research project that has measured people's loneliness, social isolation, and other factors since like the 1970s. And if you look at this research just from 1991, uh, where indicators like self-esteem and life satisfaction and other measures of psychological well-being were pretty much increasing since around 1993. With the advent actually of the smartphone, you started to see substantial declines in self-esteem and life satisfaction, along with a range of mental health outcomes, where we've actually seen a steady decline in suicide attempts and rates that was historically very promising reverse, leading many to consider this time a mental health pandemic among the younger generation. This has led to a number of news articles that probably most of us have seen, perhaps ad nauseum, uh, in part because they describe this generation as very lonely, and they document the toxic effects of loneliness on the brain, on mental health, and on physical health. But there's rarely solutions that are provided on how to mitigate this other than to increase access to meaningful interpersonal relationships and connections. Some of this research that they've done is actually in animal models. They've animals that are social, like people, have very similar brain-based effects to prolonged loneliness and isolation. Recent, this is a paper that was, or an article in a newspaper that was recently written by a mother and a daughter who are both now researchers, highlighting how the mix between the smartphone generation, whose attention is constantly being captured by large companies who are investing money to keep children's face glued to the screen, about how it's affected isolation. And they document through this longitudinal research project that whereas young people used to have many meaningful relationships, both with peers and also with non-parental adults, these types of relationships have declined over time, particularly after 2007, when the smartphone uh, experiment, as I like to call it, began. And we're still understanding the implications of this. And by no means am I a person that's anti-smartphone, but it's impossible to deny the effects that it's had on the social and interpersonal lives of young people today. And I believe that my perspective is that it's perpetuated some serious problems with social isolation and loneliness, and perpetuated some mental health problems, particularly in our young girls. This, in conjunction with the COVID-19 pandemic, has resulted in what was originally coined social distancing or physical distancing. But for many children and also adults, social distancing has turned into social isolation. And research that's being conducted rapidly during this COVID-19 process has identified that loneliness is toxic. And for most people, the sense of loneliness is very similar to what we would describe as a natural craving, similar to hunger or to thirst. It's a signal in our brain, in our body, that a basic need is not being satisfied. And the worry, especially in the social media generation, is that social media has become almost like an artificial sweetener that has no substance to it, but captures the attention, separating people from meaningful and sustained interpersonal relationships over time. Couple comments on social isolation. One of the things we know, especially with COVID-19, whereas actually many families, if you look at the research, have benefited and become closer because of COVID-19. They're spending more time with each other in the house. And for many people, this is a positive thing. This is not a positive thing for many, many other people. And these disparities are not evenly distributed. Uh, Social isolation is at greatest risk for those who have mental health problems and who live in under-resourced environments or who are traditionally minoritized or marginalized. A lot of these children that have mental health problems depend on school-based helpers and the relationships that they provide. And when schools closed, these relationships and services were largely taken from students, and we're still trying to figure it out. I put this quote from another researcher at the University of South Carolina, who's also a friend. His name's Barnett Berry, and we were emailing among superintendents in South Carolina, trying to understand the best path forward. And I thought that this line struck me in the email, and I asked him if I could share this on social. But he essentially says the COVID-19 pandemic and ensuing school closures clearly demonstrates that the colossal months-long virtual pedagogy experiment has not gone well. A major part of Dr. Berry's thesis in this is that kids are disconnected from the relationships that they desperately need at schools. And this is on top of already, prior to COVID, record levels of loneliness and disconnectedness. So although these school closures were necessary, and I completely agree with this, to flatten the medical care curve, a consequence of this necessary change was that they are ravaging the social and emotional support networks of children, where the curve has never, ever been flat. Just a couple stats on this is that children are 20 times more likely to receive supportive mental health relationships in school than any other mental health provider. In addition to this, most children who have mental health needs or could benefit from them never receive any service, and those who do receive services are often underserved based on best practices. There's millions of children across the country prior to COVID-19 who had unmet mental health needs, and now there are even more, growing that burden. With these school closures, access to critical relationships between social workers, counselors, and psychologists has been stifled. And as the director of the PhD program, I supervise practicum students in psychology. And what is happening now largely in schools is only the students with the most significant need are accessing services simply because the supply is exceeding the demand. The reason I bring this up is to say, which will hopefully be common sense to most of us, but I wanted to present some of the science on it, is that relationships matter. Relationships, to use a term from a researcher, Scar in 1992, are part of Homo sapiens' species normal environment. We grow and develop and become functioning adults when our species normal environment is satisfied. And part of that environment is access to meaningful and sustained social relationships between others. There's more recent research by Banks and Siegel, 2 books that came out in 2015, that demonstrates from a neuroscience perspective, our brains are hardwired for relationships. Without these relationships, in young children and adults, our physical and mental health suffer. This is very well documented. And social isolation, in particular in childhood and emerging adolescence, predicts poor prognosis in adulthood. Again, very well established research in this. The reason I bring this up is that mentoring, in particular youth mentoring, may be one avenue within this context of COVID-19 and the smartphone experiment to satisfy this basic need that we all have. An important part of this from that same research, the US Loneliness Index report, is that people who have daily meaningful in-person contact with another person score 20 points lower on the loneliness scale than those who don't have these in-person contacts. But importantly, only 53% of Americans actually have meaningful in-person interactions on a daily basis. The point here is that this pandemic of loneliness seems to have an antidote, and the antidote is meaningful in-person interactions with others. So is mentoring perhaps the antidote to this, which is the title of the presentation? And my answer to that is that it's complicated. And for those who are in the mentoring research field, one of the things I've written about for a while is that the enthusiasm for youth mentoring as a service, largely, especially in the early 2000s, outpaced the science. And we saw tremendous growth in mentoring organizations and nonprofit organizations that support mentoring, many of which I work with, and I'm thankful that they exist. But oftentimes, the merit of mentoring or the appraisal of the status quo, how mentoring is working right now, were misrepresented by statistics simply because you know there are incentives for representing a service that you're providing as working very well. However, the science would show, especially in the early days, that the standard form of youth mentoring, where you identify a child, you match them with adult, and what I would call the match and pray model. You match them together, and you hope that they end up being well. Uh, these type of relationships typically produce small, sometimes harmful results on young people. And if you think about it, in many ways, we're matching a stranger with a young person, hoping that somehow magic happens between them. I think importantly, especially over the recent years, the science has begun to unpack the magic a little bit for why some relationships fail and others don't, and how we can harness this positive healing energy of mentoring. And what we've learned in many ways is that the healing properties of mentoring are not that dissimilar to those of things like therapy, counseling, and psychological intervention. So effective mentoring parallels many of these existing services where we have a great deal of science to support their effectiveness. This led my colleagues, Tim Cavell and Renee Spencer and I, to consider a framework for how we discuss youth mentoring programs, both in terms of how we would manage a program if we wanted to start one as a program operating, a new program operation, how to conduct future research on understanding when, why, for whom, and how mentoring works, but also as a way to communicate the type of mentoring that we're either providing or we're studying. And this bilateral framework focuses on two aspects of mentoring, that mentoring relationships can serve both as a means and an end in promoting child well-being. I'm going to explain what I mean by this in a minute, but the important part of the framework is, as people who are interested in mentoring, if we are interested in having mentors in our schools and our nonprofits, we need to be intentional about how we approach the function of mentoring as either a means or an end or both. And I think there's good research to support that assertion. So let's start with the end. When I say mentoring relationships can serve as an end in and of themselves, it's back to the beginning of the presentation, the well-documented effects of social isolation and loneliness. Having a relationship with someone that's meaningful to a young person that they can depend on, that's recurring, can be a healing property in and of itself. And in fact, I would argue that without relationships like these in children's lives, children are not growing up in the environment that they were designed to grow up in. When mentoring relationships are understood as an end in and of themselves, this is almost like the counterpoint to an ACE, which we're probably all familiar with, in adverse childhood experiences. Researchers are now beginning to consider things called PCEs. It's the opposite of ACE, or positive childhood experiences. And what we know is that supportive relationships are one of these positive childhood experiences, a factor that's observed in research evidence that supports the optimal development of children. Researchers are beginning to call these type of relationships SSNRs, safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And they're very well documented to be a powerful positive childhood experience that can both mitigate the harmful effects of toxic environments, but also help young people reach developmental milestones that they would be expected if they did have these relationships. The goal of understanding mentoring as an end, if we think about this within our bilateral framework, is to provide durable and high quality relationships. There's no necessary need for specific structured curriculum, manuals, or intervention tactics The goal is a durable, high quality relationships. And program efforts within this approach to mentoring should be centered around recruiting, supporting, and training long term mentors. The challenge of this is that many programs have premature termination rates that approach 50% or even more, and they're not meeting this relationship as the end, as we would define these safe, stable, nurturing relationships. Fundamental to this is that a lot of the research on these safe, stable, and nurturing relationships is based on natural mentoring relationships. But relationships and mentoring programs, where again, a stranger is matched with a young person and is supported, are very different from natural mentoring relationships. And that's an important reality to consider when we're designing and evaluating our programs, is how much we can expect stable, high quality relationships through a matching process like this. But when mentoring, when it provides these safe, stable, nurturing relationships, is a worthy end in and of itself. Importantly, though, and one of the comments that we make in this new paper is that it's probably not as easy as we originally thought with the advent of the youth mentoring program growth that we saw in the late 90s and early 2000s. The match and pray model is probably not the way forward for providing these safe, stable, nurturing relationships. Mentoring programs that have high turnover or unexpected terminations are unlikely to meet this function of mentoring relationships as an end in themselves. And it likely requires programs, schools, or systems to invest substantial effort towards selecting the right mentor, providing the right training, providing support and incentives. And what I mean when I talk about incentives is I would say a model program of this type of mentoring relationships as an end is an organization that I've had the pleasure to work with called Friends of the Children. Friends of the Children is a national organization with sites in over 20 states. And they are interested in providing, no matter what, 12 years from 5K to graduation of mentoring. And they provide a full-time salaried professional mentor who has a small caseload of 8 to 10 children, and they spend roughly 4 hours each week with these children from 5K to 12th grade. And there's research evidence to support this model. Important here, though, is that the way that they have targeted these relationships is having a dedicated full-time salaried mentor that's spending time with children each week. If you're interested in learning more about that, a quick Google search could lead you to their webpage, and you could probably learn more about it. Thank you for linking that in the chat. Another idea around this area that Dr. Tim Cavell, Lindsay Weiler, and others have worked on is this notion of caregiver-initiated mentoring. And this is where mentoring programs, rather than matching strangers with young people, is that they partner with parents strategically to identify mentors, natural mentors that exist within the community context that the youth lives in. And they encourage these mentors to begin relationships with the children by providing training and support within this child's ecosystem. One of the other functions of this caregiver-initiated mentoring is encouraging help-seeking behavior of parents and talking to them about how to initiate and recruit mentors and shepherds for their children early in life, but also as they approach adolescence, when many children need a mentor. This is a very cool idea. It's a very new idea. You'll notice that both of the publications on this are 2020. I think this is a very promising approach to expanding these meaningful relationships in children's lives. Now I want to shift a little bit to this idea of mentoring as a means. So mentoring as an end, as we talked about before, the goal of mentoring is to provide a relationship. That in it of itself is a worthy goal, a challenging goal, but a worthy goal. Mentoring as a means, though, has a different perspective on what is being provided. When I say mentoring as a means, mentoring relationships, rather than being an end in themselves, also serve as a means to providing prevention and intervention focused activities. This is something, again, that Tim Cavell, Chris Elledge, and my other colleagues have written about a lot, is this idea that mentoring can serve as a way to provide other prevention and intervention focused activities. I've often used the analogy of Mary Poppins' song, uh, that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Mary Poppins was a great psychologist, in addition to some kind of weird sorcerer or sorceress. But she had this idea that it's communicated in the song that the medicine is often unpleasant and aversive in and of itself, not unlike many of the things that we know have healing properties in interpersonal relationships, like psychotherapy, counseling, and others. Like, for example, the primary treatment for anxiety behavior is exposure. And exposure is very difficult if you've ever struggled with anxiety, facing your fears and things like that. But with the care of supportive accountability from a caring person who you have a relationship, can shepherd many of these experiences and act almost like a spoonful of sugar in many difficult tasks. One part of this mentoring relationships as as means is problem-focused mentoring, which has largely been the focus of my research over the past 10 or so years. Problem focus or need mentoring is when the relationship is not the sole outcome, but rather it's seen as a vehicle to provide prevention or intervention focused activities. And this approach to we've used problem or need focused mentoring, is characterized by specific practices that are designed to prevent or treat specific problems. These could be things like aggression, academic failure, recidivism, students are coming out, or repeat offenses. Could be things like anxiety that you're helping. But the point of this is that the focus of mentoring is providing preventative or intervention focused activities that are intended to meet the needs of a child. It could also be a program that's designed to meet the needs of particular population of children, like students with disabilities. So what might problem-focused mentoring look like? This could include things like targeted skills development, reliance on evidence-based practices that are aligned with the specific needs or problems of children. I'll present a brief vignette on our program, which is called Brief Instrumental School-Based Mentoring in the scientific literature, but at the university, it's called USC Amped. And we've also got a UH Amped. I think I saw somebody from Houston in the attendee list. They might be affiliated with that, but there could also be something to interrupt specific risk factors, things like lunch buddy mentoring, which Tim Cavell and Chris Elledge have been active in studying, which the idea that these mentors visit with younger children, elementary school age children who are chronically bullied or aggressive, and they visit with them at the lunch table, intending to interrupt some of the toxic interactions that these children experience when they're at the lunch table. Another really interesting framework, particularly relevant to the COVID-19 pandemic, is mentors serving in a role as supportive accountability to promote self-help, particularly in adolescence. So Dr. Gene Rhodes at the University of Massachusetts at Boston has developed an app called Mentor Hub. And the purpose of this app is to provide supervised distance communication between mentors and mentees through a text-based service, but that it also links to mental health mobile applications that are vetted through research evidence. So a lot of these are developed at Northwestern University, but there are mental health mobile applications that have tremendous scientific evidence for reducing mental illness symptoms. The catch, though, with these apps is that most adolescents don't use them. But what Gene and others have posited is that mentors serve as an excellent opportunity to provide supportive accountability to encourage the use of these apps in adolescence. One of the cool things is that they've actually studied this at Northwestern University. And when supportive accountability is provided to young people when they're using these mental health mobile applications, the use on these mobile applications increases dramatically. And there's almost no difference between, and some mental illnesses, there's almost no difference between the mobile mental health application with supportive accountability and a trained therapist or mental health provider, which is really kind of a promising avenue for this idea of problem-focused mentoring. Example that we have at the University of South Carolina is the Brief Instrumental School-Based Mentoring Program. And this is a single school semester mentoring program. It's been provided for a range of students with a range of needs. And it's guided by a manualized approach that includes specific modules for a range of specific school-related problems, things like misconduct, academic failure, problems with relationships with teachers, goal setting, and even some internalizing problems like anxiety and depression. And mentors are trained and supervised in these evidence-based helping skills that include things like motivational interviewing and cognitive and behavioral strategies. We just recently published a paper on this, myself and Dr. Heather McDaniel at the University of Virginia, where we piloted this program with students who were rated as having the top 10% of misconduct in middle school. And we tested this program over a single semester and found that having a mentor over this semester reduced school misconduct, improved their math grades, reduced school-related problems, and also improved emotional functioning, providing some really promising preliminary evidence that this might be a helpful strategy for helping young kids who are having some externalizing problems in school.
Dr. McQuillin, can I interject for a second for a question? We've got one of our participants that's asking if a community agency is hoping to begin a mentoring program, what are the key factors you recommend they keep in mind as they begin?
So I have some comments on this later I'd love to talk about, but I'd say that key factors are to understand the assets that we have as a community interested in mentoring. So the National Mentoring Partnership, I believe it's mentoring.org, but if you Google National Mentoring Partnership, has a tremendous amount of resources, including a detailed document called the Elements of Effective Practice, which include a list of things that are designed to help produce high quality mentoring programs. And in fact, I believe later this year, they're producing another similar compendium of research evidence that provides practices for mentors, not just mentoring programs, but actually things that mentors might use to be effective. I think also considering local assets and capacity. So if you're in South Carolina, we have the Youth Empowerment Schools and Systems Research Lab. You have something called SC Mentors, which is a great organization that is operating out of Charleston. Samuel Bellamy is helping run that, and he provides consultation, technical assistance, training, and evaluation to help get programs started. But I think mapping out the assets of the local area that you're in, but also the assets that are available nationally would be a great first starting point. But I would also emphasize, and maybe out of a little bit of selfishness, I think that the bilateral framework of considering what's the function of your mentoring program is the function to provide these long-term, durable, safe, supportive, and nurturing relationships, or is it more problem or need focused? Are there specific problems that you're addressing? If it is problem or need focused, what is the research evidence on mentors helping to reduce or improve specific problems or needs that you have? And I think from that, starting with the end in mind, what you're trying to provide, that's how I'd begin to engineer a mentoring program. Great question. Thanks for asking that. So another form of this mentoring relationships as a means is something that we refer to as transitional mentoring. And transitional mentoring is similar to problem-focused mentoring, but it's providing mentoring at critical junctures in young people's experience. So this could be challenging or high-risk transitions. So for example, returning to school from the justice system, or perhaps as we might think about this, returning to school from school closures, critical life experiences. So there's some great work being done right now on similar programs for youth who survived a suicide attempt of kind of re-entering and helping them heal. We define kind of three factors associated with this idea of transitional mentoring. One is that they're supportive. So the function of transitional mentoring within this context of mentoring as a means is to support youth during a specific transition in their life. Could be the transition from elementary to middle school, after visiting the hospital or after visiting a justice system, some specific transition that is particularly high risk, challenging, or makes the youth vulnerable. It's also tactical, meaning that there's a narrow set of tasks over a limited amount of time in service of this transition. So that it's focused on some specific aspects, either preventative focus aspects or intervention focus aspects of this narrow and limited time of transition that the youth is experiencing. Another feature of transitional mentoring is that it's available. And what we mean by this is that it's deployable in an expeditious manner, that people aren't waiting to be matched for months, but that they can be deployed almost immediately. And this would require, and as some of the research in this area would show, this can be a very difficult challenge to understand how to engineer a base or a cadre of mentors who are available and deployable on demand, depending on the transitions that youth are going through. And I think this is a really worthwhile avenue for future problem or need focused mentoring. So I want to, right, we're going to finish up in just a minute. I'd love to have questions and answers and other thoughts and reactions. But I wanted to highlight one of the things that I think is really important, which is this idea of ongoing training and support for mentors. And one of the quotes that I think uh, comes to play here is, we all know that the need for mentoring is tremendous. That's the pitch of this talk and largely the pitch of my research, that these relationships are crucial to children's development, but they're not easy. My advisor used to tell me, and I'm sure others have heard it before too. He used to say, Sam, there's a simple problem to every complex solution, and it's always wrong. And one of the quotes that I think is worth heeding when we're thinking about starting mentoring programs, how our mentoring programs operating, is fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Fundamentally, in mentoring programs, we are interfering with children's lives. And there should be a little bit of hesitancy to jump in without being thoughtful in how we structure these relationships, how we train and support mentors who are engaging with children. And our research actually supports that, which I'll show you some data in a minute. But my challenge to mentoring programs is that training, supervision, and support of mentors should be the primary focus of program efforts. And the reason that I suggest this is that what we've found in research, many of the papers that Mike Lyons and myself have recently written, is many of the healing properties that mentoring appears to have mirror those of evidence-based counseling and psychotherapy practices. For most people, these approaches are not intuitive. In fact, many of our intuitive or reflexive tendencies are contrary to best practice, hence the need for training and support in these areas. I would argue, and I have argued this before, that training is one of the most important program controlled factors that can influence outcomes in youth. And in particular, ongoing proactive training that follows the course of the relationship from beginning throughout the relationship, even to the end, seems particularly important. My colleague Mike Lyons and I, he's at the University of Virginia, the Curry School of Education, conducted a study of a national database of mentoring programs that represented thousands of programs and hundreds of thousands of young people who participated in those programs. And we looked at program level data. So we're looking at how programs reported their data. And one of the things that we were interested in is we wondered what predicted premature closures. Premature closures are obviously important given the importance of safe, stable, and nurturing environments. They're one of the reasons that we would consider programs failing to meet their goals, is if the relationships terminate prior to when they're expected. And we did a cool study where we used some artificial machine learning statistics to identify what was the single best predictor of premature match closures. So we threw in like 30 different variables that included things like if the youth were justice involved, the budget of the program, the ethnic background of the children, the resources that their parents had, if their parents had been incarcerated, if the kids were in special education, so on and so forth. And the single best predictor of premature match closure was whether or not, or how much, in fact, mentors received ongoing training, support, or supervision. So this training component is critically important if we're going to use mentoring as an antidote to this idea of social isolation. And it's great because it is a program controlled factor. Programs can control this. They can influence this. There's many things about the children that we serve, the context of their communities, their family makeup that we don't have control over. But training and ongoing support seems like one. Really important to this, though, is this is not pre-service training, which was actually included in our model. It's not pre-service training that they receive before they go and match. It's ongoing training and support. And it seems to be that multiple support contacts with staff throughout a month seems to be somewhat of a sweet spot for providing that. More than one contact over the month as they're meeting with children. We've also studied this in my own program, the AMP program before. So in a quasi experiment that we did comparing two programs, one program that had upfront training and no proactive support, and then one program that had proactive support. And one of the striking differences was the second study actually showed that mentoring worked, where the first study showed that mentoring didn't work at all. And there was actually some question if mentoring might have been harmful to the kids who participated in it. But the key defining feature of this second study was that we provided this ongoing proactive training and support where mentors received supervision and guidance from a person that had qualified credentials. And what we noticed is that mentors actually reported and noticed these differences in training. They perceived the training as being higher quality. They were more satisfied in their relationships with the young people that they worked with. In fact, they were more likely to continue mentoring than they were in their first program. And they also found greater value in the things that they were trained in during pre-service training, presumably meaning that they actually used the things during the program. So some concluding remarks, and I'd love to chat a little bit. I think we're going to have about 15 minutes for Q&A and chat. Is my concluding remarks for it's critically important to strengthen and expand youth mentoring efforts. So even though I'm skeptical of kind of the status quo, I sincerely believe that one of the ways that we can help cure this pandemic of loneliness and social isolation that we're having right now is strengthening, expanding mentoring efforts. Right now, the USC AMP program is fully digital, but we are still operating. We have mentors on Zoom, meeting with mentees on Zoom, oftentimes during school hours that their teachers are getting set up for them, their parents are getting set up for them. There's ways to engineer this stuff even during social distancing so that youth don't have to be socially isolated. Right now, though, we're at a critical juncture with COVID-19 and the generation that we're learning to care for is that youth are lonelier, more isolated, and more disconnected from helping systems than they've been in modern history. And something has to change. And I think mentoring can play a role in that. Other concluding remarks are that how we approach mentoring, to the question that was asked earlier, how we would develop, design a mentoring program or think about quality improvements in our own mentoring program depends on the goals of the mentoring. In our bilateral framework, we propose that mentoring can serve as an end in and of itself, but also as a means to more problem or need focused mentoring or transitional mentoring. And the structures of mentoring programs and the goals of mentoring programs must be aligned with the training, support, and supervision infrastructure that the program can offer. And I think a lot of times mentoring programs can get in over their head if they're not able to provide that ongoing support, training, and supervision. Final concluding remark is to avoid wishful thinking that we're probably all guilty of, because we want so bad to satisfy the needs of these young people and help them. But we have to privilege scientific evidence that is beginning to demonstrate how effective mentoring works. And we have to orient our programs around this evidence as we learn to adapt to the changing circumstances in these children's environment. Things like COVID-19, mobile phone use and other things. So I will now open it up for questions and comments. I believe I hit my mark. How close did I get? Right on time. So 15 minutes for Q&A. Happy to hang out too if you have more specific questions that you'd prefer not to ask in the crowd. I have about 15 minutes. So I see a question from Jacqueline Anderson. How do you see the future of mentoring given school closures and an unknown future and use of virtual mentoring? Would hybrid or virtual mentoring be feasible? Would it be sustainable and scalable to maintain mentors through virtual methods? Also, will it be as effective as in person? So those are lingering questions that researchers across the country, I believe, actually, I think Michelle Kaufman is actually working on a study for this, but the question of can virtual mentoring work? We're trying it out right now with a pilot at the University of South Carolina with the All for SC team out of the College of Education. And we have Zoom mentors that are going through the USC AMPed curriculum with young people in high schools and Fairfield County schools, as well as we're expanding next semester to others. we have, and as Jacqueline mentioned, is that we have an unknown future for how this is going to look. And it's hard to see how this might play out in the future. Right now, preliminarily, we don't have any hard data, but many of the same types of relationships and interactions and experiences that young people receive when they're having an in-person mentor using the AMP curriculum are very similar to what we're seeing on Zoom in our supervision meetings. There are logistic challenges that are much harder than when kids are directly reporting to the school district. So I think attrition or meeting misses will be harder to navigate, at least initially, than they would for more in-person meetings where the child is going to be at the school. Great question. Will it be as effective? I don't know. And I think that's something that I would love to conduct and learn more about research on that.
Compassionate curiosity, Sam, could you expand on the types of training that have been most effective, whether it's for generalized mentoring or a specific problem-focused mentoring?
Yeah, great question. So the best research on this, actually, there's just a recent meta-analysis that came out, and I'll actually try and link that in the chat before I go. But recent meta-analysis found that mentoring programs that provided targeted training to mentors to provide mentoring on specific outcomes for kids were more effective than programs that were more general. This important caveat with that, though, is that it's difficult to understand with the current research base how to provide these, what I would call the mentoring as an end, the more supportive, safe, stable, nurturing relationships. What we do know from the work that we've done is that in our curriculum, a lot of our training efforts are focused on what we would like mentors to do. And largely what we would like them to do are things that are grounded in scientific evidence or best practice. And then also things that we would like them not to do. So my colleague, Dr. Mariah Kornblue, often refers to these as potential harm behaviors. So these might be belittling or arguing with the kid or being culturally insensitive or using phrases or terms that might be considered microaggressions when with children. So I think a lot of our training focuses on very specific things to avoid and very specific things to do. I think as research expands, we'll probably learn more about general approaches to sustaining positive and healthy relationships. It would probably be more appropriate for that mentoring as an end. Great question, though. Thank you. It looks like we have a question from Nicole. Are there potential benefits to the increased accessibility to technology? May this allow us to reach children who previously had more difficulty accessing resources such as mentorship, particularly with digital natives, perhaps texting, et cetera, offers new forms of mentorship. I think it's a really great point, and that's the hope that Dr. Jean Rhodes is really developing this Mentor Hub app around, is that cell phones are ubiquitous right now. And wouldn't it be great if rather than having big companies that compete for children's attention for likes and clicks and retweets, that we have healthy organizations that are promoting health and well-being for young people, competing for their attention. I think the prototype of Dr. Rhodes' app, Mentor Hub, is really phenomenal, and I'm on there helping advise on how they develop that. And that really is the hope, is that we can perhaps in some ways exploit this proclivity towards texting and smartphone use to really engage in meaningful relationships through technology. And I've noticed that just with my own children with Zoom school, is that they seem totally fine with it in some ways, that they picked up on it, much quicker than I think I would have at the same time. Great question.
So Dr. McQuillin, do you want to leave a couple more minutes, see if we've got any last minute questions from the crew, or should we go ahead and sign off for today and offer 10 extra minutes of self-care time? I will leave that in your wheelhouse.
I could use 10 extra minutes of self-care time, so I might opt for that one, but I'm happy to correspond with you over Twitter or over email. So feel free to, hit me up on Twitter or our research labs. New Instagram is U of SC Yes. check that out as well. We're going to be trying to post some more mentoring focused content in the future. We just started though. So
You did get one more question about apps that you recommend.
So it's a great question. And my advice would be to actually visit and I'm going to stop sharing so I can find this link. Visit the Mentor Hub. So I'll just put this in the chat. And it has some great information on what Mentor Hub is, and then also the type of apps that they're integrating into the service. I'm going to put this in the chat. So it's mentorhubapp.org.
Awesome. Well, incredibly grateful for you today, Dr. McQuillin. This was phenomenal. I know it's going to be a fantastic resource to add to our archive. So please, those of you that participated with us today, share this content with your friends, with your family members, with your colleagues, so that we can uplift this incredibly important conversation. On behalf of the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina, massive thank you to you, Sam, and massive thank you to everyone that joined us today. Please check out our content on Facebook, on YouTube, as well as our website, www.schoolbehavioralhealth.org. And if you'd like to nominate or share the spotlight with any wonderful humans in your community, please nominate them on our website so that we can promote them across our social media platforms. Thank you. And we'll go ahead and engage in that very needed self-care.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Y'all be well. Thanks so much.